Hi, I'm Paul Feinberg. I'm host of UCLA Anderson's podcast. My guest today is Professor Corinne Bendersky. We'll be talking about some of her most recent research. Corinne, I know you have a paper that I believe came out last year, but before we talk about the paper, maybe you can give a little preface and talk about what status is, because I know that status is one of the main topics of the research.
Yeah, sure. So status is it's basically social respect. So it's how prestigious somebody is, how esteemed they are, and it's related to all kinds of things like being influential in groups, perceptions of higher performance, perceptions of contributing more to groups and teams, and is often associated with tangible financial outcomes like being paid more, access to more promotions and better quality jobs. So it's a very valuable resource, but it's a socially exchanged resource. It's not an objective resource that someone has a certain amount of. You only have status to the extent that other people recognize and acknowledge your high status. It's an interesting resource for that reason.
Okay, so with that as a kind of a setup, why don't you talk a little bit about the paper and the research?
Sure. So we looked at status within small task groups. So these are groups of people who are working together, 4 to 6 people. And most of the research on status in groups like this has looked at which people in the group get higher status or lower status at the beginning of the group's life, and they stop there. And we were interested in studying what happened over time as group relationships evolve and change as members work together. And because status is valuable, and there has been some research on people really working to try to achieve higher status, we decided to look at the status relationships over the whole life cycle of a group. And what we found is that people's status positions moved quite a bit. Some people stayed in the same status position throughout the whole group, but some people achieved higher status and some people lost status over the course of the group's life. So then we looked at what happened to people in terms of their individual performance, if they stayed in the same status position or if they gained or lost status over time. And we found some really interesting, unexpected things. So people who are in high status positions from the beginning and maintain them perform better than people who are in low status positions and stay in those positions over time. And that is what we expected. The interesting, unexpected results were when we looked at the performance of people who gained status or lost status. And since people who are high status perform better, we thought that people who gained status should perform better as well. And since people who were low status performed worse, we thought people who would lose status would perform worse. But that's not what we found. We found people who gained status didn't perform any better than those who stayed in stable, low status positions. And people who lost status didn't perform any worse than people who started and held on to high status positions.
So what types of groups did you look at, and how did you measure status? Did you just talk to the members? So talk a little bit about the methods and how you came to gather the data.
Sure. We looked at MBA student groups, and we mostly worked with student groups who are in our fully employed MBA program, just because those are the ones that we had easier access to. So these are their study groups during the first quarter of the program. So they didn't know each other before these groups formed, and they were together for the full 10-week quarter. So it was nice because we could see the full duration of the group's life cycle in a relatively short amount of time. And we had lots of groups that were all starting and ending at the same time, all working on the same kind of projects. And so we could compare the performance of individuals across these different groups. The way we measured status was we asked each person in the group to rate every other member of the group, including themselves, in terms of these status-related attributes that I mentioned earlier: respect, esteem, prestige, prominence in the group. So it's called a round-robin rating survey.
So then did you periodically go back to them over the span, and is that how you measured the changes?
Yes, exactly. So we measure their status perceptions early, right about a week after the groups formed, and then again at the very end of the quarter, right before their final exam, so after they finished all of their joint coursework and before the final exam. And we then we measured their performance on individual assignments throughout the quarter, and their performance on their final exam, and their total performance in the form of their final grades for the courses.
Were there any attributes of what's the attribute of a high status person who's viewed by his peers, his or her peers, excuse me, after only knowing that person for a week? How did you get a sense of how people were deciding who had high status and who didn't right from the get-go?
Yeah, and actually there's a lot of research on how that happens, because scholars have found that status is attributed very quickly. It's very fundamental to our social makeup, that we sort of look at someone and very quickly form an impression about whether that person is high status or low status. So the things that are related to high status in those initial impressions may be demographic characteristics. So men are generally considered higher status than women. Whites are generally considered higher status than non-whites. And within some boundaries, older people, but not very old, are considered higher status than younger people. Also, whatever task-relevant experience somebody brings to the table that's visible to your peers. So you've worked in similar kinds of projects, you have other prior degrees, for instance, you come from a very reputable educational background, all of those things contribute to people's perceptions of your status. And then the third category of things that impact initial status impressions is how you comport yourself. If you're very assertive, if you're very dominant and you convey a lot of confidence, other people then interpret that as a sign that, oh, well, this person deserves high status.
So, and it sounds to me, based on your findings, that one of the most significant attributes of someone who's going to achieve is someone who makes that good first impression, because the I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the high status person initially is going to perform better than someone who starts low status and then proves themselves over time.
Yeah, those first impressions matter a lot. But remember, it's only the people who maintain their high status positions. We had a lot of students in our samples who started high but lost status. So those who start high do need to invest some resources in maintaining their high status positions. And that's sort of the bottom line of all of this research, is that status doesn't come cheaply. People need to work and invest effort and attention and other kinds of personal resources, both in increasing their status and in maintaining their high status positions. And it's those resource investments in status enhancement and maintenance that are traded off, in a sense, for individual performance.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so if you're in a high status position from the beginning, you accrue a body, a stock of resources that accumulate and grow over time. So that, yes, even though you may be putting some effort into maintaining that high status position, you also have a lot of other beneficial resources that you're accruing as a result of your structurally high position in the group that you can then also put towards your performance. So the performance is high even though there's work being done to maintain the high status. But if you're not in that really high position, you don't get all of those other benefits accumulating, then there's a cost to your individual performance. You basically have to make decisions about where you're going to invest your resources. Is it in status interests or in performance interests?
You mentioned grades were one of the measures. Did the faculty teaching these groups, are they aware of who is high status and who is low status, or are they're doing their grading just objectively, and it just turned out that those with high status, I guess, perform better? Were the faculty involved at all?
Yeah, so it was the latter. So the faculty who were doing the grading may have had some sense of high status students in the entire class section of 72 people, say. But what we were looking at was the status hierarchy within each study group. And the faculty really don't have a good sense of even who's in which study group, let alone the dynamics within each group. So the grade and the performance decision and evaluation was really independent of the students' status positions in the group.
So what's maybe the practical implication for this? Now, I'm a person in the workplace, or anyone now knows the results of this. What do I do? Do I really work on my first impressions because that gives me a big head start? Like, where does that play in?
I think there are somewhat different implications if you are a group member and if you are a group leader or manager that's trying to form an effective group. So for a group member, indeed, the big takeaway is first impressions matter. And to the extent that you can sort of claim a high status position at the beginning, present yourself very assertively, present yourself as very competent on the task that the group is going to be forming, convey expertise, that is real. So one of the things we found actually is people who overstate their expertise, they tend to lose status over time. So a lot of bluster and hubris is not necessarily a good thing. But really presenting yourself in the strongest possible light to your group mates is a very important and personally beneficial thing in the group. That's not too surprising. But the reasons why that's beneficial based on our research are a little different than the common lay knowledge. If you are a manager and you are forming a group and you're concerned about optimal performance of the group and of the individuals who are doing tasks that are related to the group's outcome, then you should be aware of and concerned about group members who seem to be particularly concerned about seeking status. And they're kind of politicking or schmoozing or doing things that indicate that they're really attentive to their social positions in the group, and realize that that actually is a distraction, a true distraction from their individual performance. So you might, as a leader, try to select people who don't seem to be confident and secure in their social positions in the organization, and then they don't have as great concerns in the group. Or you may do things to try to ease people's feelings that they're in lower status positions than they deserve, or we would call a status threat. So you may really try to provide them with a lot of accolades, a lot of attention. When you form the group and you introduce group members to each other, identifying each group member's expertise and why it is that they are on this team and how uniquely they will be able to contribute to the group may ease some of the concerns about status positions in that group.
Do you have any plans for further research along these lines? Is there a next project that you could tell us about?
Yeah, so the next project is looking at the personality characteristics that are associated with people who are more likely to invest resources in enhancing their status, and those who are likely to invest insufficient resources in maintaining their status. So basically what personality traits seem to be associated with increasing and losing status. And what we're finding is actually quite interesting. Two personality traits, neuroticism, which is like social anxiety, and extroversion, which is being very outgoing and socially oriented, play really important roles. In those early initial status assessments, extroversion is associated with higher status, and neuroticism is associated with lower status. But over time, we see those positions flipping, or those relationships flipping, such that neuroticism seems to be associated with greater investments in status enhancement that actually pays off in terms of group mates and peers attributing neurotic group members with increased status over time. Extroverts seem to be less concerned about maintaining their status and actually lose status over time. Their peers over time confer lower status to them.